By the time the great oak doors of the Quartermain mansion swung inward and the first guests drifted into the paneled foyer, the old house had already decided to misbehave. Portraits seemed to watch more closely than usual. The grandfather clock ticked with the judgmental rhythm of a gavel. It was the kind of day when the family expected grief to behave itself, to sit quietly beside the tea service while Alexis Davis performed the solemn choreography of a will reading. Instead, grief brought company, old grudges, fresh schemes, and one woman who refused to stay on the margins. Veronica Ronnie Bard arrived as if she had always belonged to the place. The air changed with her presence, drawing quick looks from servants and relatives alike. Ned Quartermain had been rehearsing a dozen ways to keep the morning orderly. None included Ronnie stepping across the threshold with an invitation she claimed was indisputable. Surprise flickered across his face, then the practiced Quartermain civility recovered and tried to contain it. But the shock never quite left his eyes. Ronnie saw it, allowed herself the faintest smile, and moved through the room as if gravity had chosen her. If invitations were meant to bar the door, Ronnie had found the secret hinges. She insisted she had been summoned, then clarified that she had also been warned, by a phone call that suggested today's gathering would not follow the usual Quartermain script. Whether that call had been a courtesy or a trap, she didn't say. It was enough to plant questions in the corners of the room where the family preferred dust to truth. Tracy Quartermain made no effort to disguise her fury. For Tracy, protocol was a weapon sharpened over decades, and Ronnie's insistence cut against the grain. Words clashed with that exquisite Quartermain polish, each sentence a veiled charge, each breath a claim of standing. The argument gained speed, then stalled only when Ronnie, unruffled, took a seat in the living room as though the chair had been saving itself for her all along. The message was simple. She intended to hear exactly what Monica had arranged, and she intended to hear it from Alexis's mouth, with every heir and adversary present to witness. Alexis did not rush. She carried Monica's papers the way a medic carries a fragile pulse, aware that the smallest misstep could turn order into crisis. Her voice, steady but edged with reverence, threaded through the legal preamble, the customary bequests, the acknowledgments of loyalty and service that often soften the sharper angles of an estate. For a time, the room complied. Every clause breathed of the life Monica had lived, its discipline, its generosity, its complicated family orbit. Heads bowed. Hands folded. Even Tracy's impatience held to a simmer. Then Alexis reached the final page, and the air thinned. Monica's legacy, she said, contained an extraordinary provision. The Quartermain mansion, the house that had flattened scandal with its sheer weight, that had swallowed fights and laughter and 100 reconciliations, was to pass not to a long-standing Quartermain heir but to Veronica Ronnie Bard. Silence is never total in that room. There is always a soft rasp of disbelief, the tiny clink of a glass set down too hard, a breath held too long. But this silence came close. What had been inconceivable a moment before now stood complete and elegant in legal language, polished by ink and witnessed signatures. Every eye sought an explanation. Ned's hands tightened on the arm of his chair. Alexis's gaze remained neutral by force of discipline. Tracy's shock calcified into a brittle laugh that fooled no one. On paper, a decision like that requires little explanation beyond the document itself. In Port Charles, paper is only the start of a story. The whisper already forming around the room carried a familiar name, Martin Gray. He had warned Tracy repeatedly that the old games had consequences, that pushing too hard at the margins of power would stress even the strongest family frame. If this was his design, if he had manipulated circumstances so that Monica's final word placed the house in Ronnie's hands, then the architect had stepped out from behind the curtain in the boldest way possible. The insult to Tracy added savor to the shock. Her bequest, tucked like a thorn into the formal language, was a single relic from Lila Quartermain's cherished pantry, a jar of the famous pickles. To anyone else, it might have read a sentiment, the kind of heirloom that carries memory. To Tracy, paired with the loss of the mansion, it felt like a taunt. The jar, genteel and unmistakable, changed character, it became a punchline pretending to be a keepsake. Somewhere, one could almost hear Martin's soft, precise amusement. Yet the Quartermaines know better than most that a will is not a tombstone but a flare. If manipulation had touched Monica's papers, it would leave residue. The truth has a way of leaching into daylight in this town, slowly, stubbornly, and with a habit of choosing the worst possible moment. If Martin had rearranged the pieces, discovery would not be a matter of if, but when, and when it came, it would exact a price. While the shock unfurled at the mansion, Martin kept his schedule. He met with Tracy to address a separate conflict whose sting had not faded, the lawsuit arising from Drew Kane's ejection at Monica's memorial. Martin's posture, clinical, faintly offended, framed the incident as an attack, an affront Tracy should acknowledge and remedy. Tracy, who had been fighting ghosts all morning, refused the script. She would not apologize. She would not reinterpret her authority through Martin's lens. If Drew wished to elevate grief to litigation, she would meet him in court with the full ferocity of a woman who had been taught to win by losing first. It was not bravado. Tracy understands that courts are theaters where money buys better balconies but cannot guarantee applause. Still, she thrives in those spaces where narrative and leverage intersect. The mansion's shock had cornered her, the lawsuit offered movement. And movement is where she is most dangerous. Drew, for his part, was drawing his own map. Exclusion is a simple word with complicated scars, and learning he had been cut out of Monica's will opened a wound he thought he had hardened against. The Quartermaine family has always rewarded tenacity with suspicion, and Drew had earned both in equal measure. But this was a different kind of rejection, one that spoke with the authority of the dead and the sanction of the law. He felt himself pushed back to the perimeter, an outsider to a legacy he had fought to honor. The result was a plan not yet fully sketched, but certain in its target. If the Q machine intended to grind him down, he would feed it gears that could not be swallowed. Revenge, in Port Charles, does not always come with fireworks. It can arrive as a compliance audit, an inconvenient leak, a story placed where it will be seen by the right pair of eyes at the worst possible time. Drew began to think in those terms, of quiet demolitions and pressure points. He catalogued vulnerabilities in the Quartermaine edifice, and one name glowed with a particular intensity: Michael Corinthos. In recent months, Michael's poise had looked like leadership. To Drew, in this light, it looked like a facade begging to be cracked. If he needed to make the family feel his absence as a threat rather than a relief, then Michael, so central to their current balance, offered ideal leverage. Back at the mansion, the ramifications of Alexis's final paragraph continued to spool outward. Ned struggled to frame a response that did not betray his own uncertainty. The administrative realities of such a bequest were mind-bending, the emotional ones, worse. Ronnie's demeanor remained unreadable. If she was stunned, she wore the surprise as if it were tailored. She asked for nothing, demanded nothing, and thereby claimed everything. There was a strange grace in it, as if the house itself had stretched toward her and she, with a mixture of humility and resolve, had accepted the weight. That acceptance came with an immediate web of questions. Would Ronnie's possession be ceremonial or absolute? Would the rooms that had been contested 100 times now answer to a voice untrained in Quartermaine warfare? Would the staff align themselves quietly, as they always did, with the strongest hand? The subtle choreography of power in the mansion depends on signals too small to measure: who calls the florist, who corrects the caterer, who places a hand on the banister as if it belongs there. Ronnie understood this intuitively. Before the gathering dissolved, she had already sent 2 messages, one of gratitude, measured enough to avoid triumph, and one of continuity, reassuring enough to soothe the nerves of a house that does not like to learn new steps. Tracy's anger did not cool, it refined. The jar, Lila's jar, became a pivot rather than an insult. If Martin intended to humiliate her, he had misjudged. She would turn sentiment into strategy. Somewhere between the china cabinet and the legal library, she found the steadiness that has always separated her from amateurs. She began to reconstruct timelines, cross-reference conversations, exhume small irregularities that had seemed harmless in the moment. For all his quiet power, Martin is human. Humans make errors, especially when they believe their brilliance is invisible. Tracy meant to find them. Martin, however, had accounted for counterpunches. He kept his tone controlled, his calendar full, his narrative ready for retelling in any room that mattered. If the will had been adjusted, it had been adjusted with care. He trusted in the elasticity of plausible explanations, in the way grief can be coaxed into accepting the unlikely as inevitable. He suspected, too, that the family's internal fractures would serve him better than any document, because families, unlike contracts, leak. Into those leaks, Drew poured intent. He revisited his alliances with a colder eye, separating sympathy from utility. If Michael's composure masked cracks, he would learn where to tap. If the Quartermaines wanted him exiled from the narrative, he would return as the structural engineer who understands exactly which beams can be loosened with a quiet twist. His anger was not loud, it was disciplined. That made it dangerous. Port Charles has endured enough upheaval to recognize the onset of another. The mansion's new gravity would pull unexpected objects into orbit. Alexis, who had only meant to honor Monica's last instructions with fidelity, would find herself chronicling the fallout in legal addenda and emergency meetings. Ned would have to reimagine leadership with a wild card living under the same roof. Staff would carry stories from room to room on silver trays. Investors would call with polite inquiries that were not polite at all. And Ronnie, whose name had just been engraved on the deed of a complicated kingdom, would learn that houses like this one demand loyalty the way a storm demands glass. To hold it, she would have to understand not only the mechanics of ownership but the choreography of belonging. Her greatest obstacle would not be Tracy's rage or Martin's cunning, it would be the living memory of a family that resists replacement even when it invites it. Monica's choice, authentic or engineered, could not be revoked by outrage. It would have to be answered. If Martin had indeed rearranged the endgame, then exposure would not simply restore an old order. Too much damage had already been done, too many truths suggested themselves where none had been before. Lila's jar, perched innocently on a shelf, felt suddenly like an oracle, mute but relentless. It saw what was coming, hearings and countersuits, midnight calls, the cold arithmetic of inheritance turning to war. Somewhere beneath the surface, the truth tugged like a current. It would carry secrets from their hiding places, not because anyone invited it, but because Port Charles is built on bedrock that refuses to keep the dead's intentions tidy. The mansion, meanwhile, settled a fraction of an inch on its foundations, adjusting to a new name on its deed and the tremors of insult echoing from every corridor. In another wing, a clock reset itself after a power flicker no one noticed. Time, as ever, would decide whose version of events became history. The only certainty belonged to the fallout. Tracy would not let the affront pass unavenged. Martin would not surrender a victory without extracting something in return. Ronnie would not relinquish a home she had barely had time to claim. And Drew, standing just beyond the gates with a plan tightening like a fist, would not give the Quartermaines the luxury of ignoring him. If he needed to break the family's composure to make them feel his absence, he would start with Michael, because toppling a house sometimes begins by nudging the pillar everyone mistakes for decor. Thus the day that was meant to honor Monica's legacy became the day her legacy was weaponized. The paper said one thing, the people would make it say another. In Port Charles, that is not sacrilege, it is ritual. And as the sun slipped across the lawn and the last of the guests left with more questions than condolences, the mansion did what it always does, it listened, learned, and prepared to survive whoever claimed to own it next.